he would witness an attempted coup by communist hardliners,
The leadership of the Soviet Communist Party and the KGB and
angry
everything.
about democratic reforms.
This has been an extraordinary day in
The plotters of that attempted coup and everything. The KGB, the police, the army, the tanks.
day in the Soviet Union.
The difficulty of the war.
Soviet power. Vladimir Putin is watching all this from St. Petersburg. August of 1991 is when the last gasp of the hardliners tries to preserve.
Is Vladimir Putin's iron grip on power in peril?
Now on frontline, Putin.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe lay in ruins. Cities once full of life had been reduced to rubble. The Soviet Union had paid one of the heaviest prices of all. More than 26 million lives lost, families shattered, children orphaned, and whole generations scarred by hunger, cold, and silence. It was into this world, one of both triumph and devastation, that a child would be born. A child who would grow up surrounded not by the luxuries of power, but by its absence. A boy destined to walk through the narrow, crumbling streets of Leningrad, unaware that those same footsteps would one day echo through the halls of the Kremlin, and across the globe. Early family roots. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in the city once known as Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. His birth was not in a palace, nor in the comfort of abundance, but in a communal apartment, the kind of place where families crowded together, sharing kitchens, sharing stories, and most of all, sharing survival. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, had been a factory worker and a war veteran. He fought in the Navy during World War II and endured the bitter siege of Leningrad. His mother, Maria Ivanovna Shelemova, was a gentle, quiet woman who carried the scars of hardship with her in silence. Both parents knew hunger, both knew loss. 2 sons had been born before Vladimir, but both had died young. For Maria, the grief of losing children was unbearable. When her 3rd child arrived, she carried him as both a fragile blessing and a fragile hope. In later years, Putin himself would recall, "My mother loved me very much. And I could feel it. But she also knew what suffering meant. She had lost children before me. She was afraid she would lose me too." The city he inherited. Leningrad in 1952 was no ordinary city. It was a city still haunted by the shadows of war. Just a decade earlier, the German army had laid siege to it for nearly 900 days. Hunger had been so severe that people ate wallpaper paste, animals, even the leather from their shoes. More than 1 million civilians perished in that siege. By the time Putin was born, the city was rebuilding, but the scars were everywhere, on the walls, on the streets, and on the faces of its people. Life was hard. Rations were low. Eating was scarce. Every family carried a story of loss. For young Vladimir, this environment became more than just a backdrop. It was his first teacher. He was not born into comfort. He was born into struggle, into a world where survival itself was an achievement. The communal apartment. The Putins lived in a communal apartment, a Soviet reality for millions. Dozens of families packed into one building, each with a single room to their name. Kitchens were shared. Bathrooms were shared. Privacy was rare and disputes were common. Putin's family had just 16 square meters of space, barely enough for a bed, a table, and a stove. In that room, his parents tried to build a life, raise a child, and forget their sorrows. The walls carried every sound of the neighbors, quarrels, laughter, lullabies. In this environment, young Vladimir learned an important truth, that strength often meant silence, patience, and endurance. The atmosphere at home. His father was strict, hardened by war. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were commands. Discipline was not optional, it was survival. His mother, by contrast, was kind, spiritual, deeply religious in a time when faith was frowned upon. She would secretly baptize Vladimir in the Russian Orthodox Church, a quiet act of defiance against the atheist state. That mixture of strictness and tenderness would stay with Vladimir for life. From his father, he learned the language of control. From his mother, the language of faith and resilience. A boy surrounded by shadows. As a child, Putin often found himself wandering the courtyards and stairwells of Leningrad's old buildings. They were places full of rough boys, stray cats, and endless dangers. Fights broke out often. Knives were sometimes pulled. For many, it was a place where you either learned to defend yourself, or you didn't last long. Putin would later recall, there were rats running around in the stairwells. I remember once I cornered a rat with a stick. But then it turned and attacked me. I realized something then: when you corner someone you must be very careful. Because then they have nothing left to lose. It was an image that would follow him all his life, a metaphor he would later apply not only to his childhood but to politics, strategy, and war. The weight of history. Every day, young Vladimir was reminded of the sacrifices that allowed him to even exist. His father had been gravely injured during the war. His mother had nearly starved during the siege. Relatives had perished. The air was filled with stories of courage and horror, of neighbors who had died, of friends who had disappeared. For the boy, history was not in textbooks. It was at his dinner table, in the silence of his parents' eyes, in the crumbling walls of his city. And though he was too young to fully grasp it, the burden of the past shaped the ambition of his future. Seeds of ambition. Even in those early years, there was something restless about Vladimir. He was small in size, often underestimated, but inside burned a hunger, an instinct to prove himself. He wanted more than just survival. He wanted control. Teachers would remember him as mischievous, quick-tempered, sometimes difficult to manage. But beneath that surface was a boy observing, calculating, waiting. He was fascinated by stories of spies, of secret agents, of silent power. While other boys dreamed of becoming soldiers or workers, Vladimir dreamed of shadows, of the unseen hand that moved the world. The camera slowly pans over the gray skyline of Leningrad, the mist of the Neva River rising in the cold morning air. The narrator's voice lowers, solemn, deliberate. Vladimir Putin was not born into greatness. He was born into scarcity, grief, and silence. His first lessons came not from classrooms but from stairwells, not from textbooks but from the whispered stories of survivors. In the narrow corridors of a communal apartment, in the shadows of a city still scarred by war, the boy who would one day command the largest nation on earth first opened his eyes. He was not yet a leader. He was not yet a fighter. He was not yet the man the world would come to know. But the stage was set. The city of Leningrad had given him his first gift, a baptism by hardship. And hardship was the seed from which his destiny would grow. Narration. Childhood is supposed to be a time of innocence, a time of games, of wonder, of safety. But for Vladimir Putin, childhood was never simple. It was carved from the harsh stones of poverty, loss, and survival. The Soviet Union of the 1950s was recovering from war, but for families like the Putins, recovery meant making do with almost nothing. For Vladimir, this environment didn't just shape his childhood. It forged his character, molding him into someone who would one day walk into history with the confidence of a man who had known struggle from his earliest breath. School years, a restless student. When Vladimir first entered school number 193 in Leningrad, he was far from the perfect student. Teachers described him as energetic, often distracted, and sometimes mischievous. He had a sharp mind, but his attention was elsewhere, drawn more to the streets than the classroom. There were fights. There were pranks. There were days when he tested the patience of his instructors. One teacher would later recall. He was not easy. Small in size but very proud, very stubborn. He did not like being told what to do. This stubbornness, this refusal to bow easily to authority, was both a challenge and a clue. Beneath the surface there was a boy who wanted not just to follow, but to lead. The streets of Leningrad. Outside of school, the courtyards became his training ground. Leningrad's courtyards were not playgrounds in the Western sense. They were arenas, places where children learned to stand their ground, where hierarchies were formed with fists and willpower. Putin, small and wiry, had to fight harder than most. He was often underestimated, but he never shied away from confrontation. If someone challenged him, he answered. If someone pushed, he pushed back harder. It was here that he developed a streetwise resilience, an ability to calculate quickly, to assess threats, to strike when necessary. These were not lessons from books. These were lessons written in bruises. The influence of his parents. At home, the contrast between his parents shaped him deeply. His father remained stern, often cold, a man of few words but strong expectations. He demanded discipline, respect, and toughness. His mother, by contrast, offered tenderness, faith, and quiet love. Maria Ivanovna prayed secretly, attending church when she could, whispering her faith to her son. In a Soviet world where religion was discouraged, this quiet act gave young Vladimir something rare, a glimpse of spiritual depth, a reminder that strength could also mean compassion. It was this balance, between his father's iron and his mother's softness, that would define him. In the years ahead, he would often present a face of steel to the world, but inside, the memory of his mother's care remained. Fascination with stories of power. Even as a boy, Vladimir was fascinated by tales of heroes, spies, and hidden power. He devoured books about Soviet intelligence officers, men who worked in the shadows, influencing events without being seen. While other children dreamed of being pilots or engineers, he dreamed of becoming part of something secret, something larger. He once told a childhood friend, "One man in intelligence can do more for his country than an army." This fascination was not just imagination, it was the beginning of a vision. A dream that would later guide his choices as a teenager and young man. Struggles with discipline. But childhood was not without mistakes. Vladimir's rebellious streak often got him into trouble. His teachers worried he was slipping behind, that his energy was wasted on fights and distractions. One day, after yet another outburst, a teacher confronted him, telling him that he had the intelligence to succeed, but only if he learned control. It was a moment that stayed with him. He realized that if he wanted to achieve his dreams, raw aggression would not be enough. He would need discipline. He would need to master himself. This realization would lead him in time toward martial arts, a path that would teach him balance, patience, and strategy. The quiet faith of his mother. Meanwhile, his mother's influence grew stronger. She took him to church in secret, baptized him into the Orthodox faith. For Vladimir, this was more than ritual, it was a bond, a sense of belonging to something eternal. In later years, he would reflect on this moment, saying, "Faith became something personal, something deep inside me. It gave me strength when there was little else." Even in his childhood, in a system that sought to erase religion, young Vladimir carried a quiet cross in his heart. Lessons of hunger and hardship. The Putins were poor. There were times when food was scarce, when every ruble mattered, when warmth was a luxury. Vladimir wore hand-me-down clothes, shared limited space, and watched his parents stretch resources to survive. This poverty was not simply an obstacle, it was a teacher. It taught him frugality, caution, and an instinct never to waste. It taught him that nothing came easily, that everything had to be earned. Later in life, when he rose to power, critics would see his cautious, calculating nature. But those who knew his past understood, caution was not strategy, it was survival. Small victories, growing confidence. Despite struggles, Vladimir began to show signs of growth. When he applied himself, he excelled. His sharp memory, his ability to focus when he chose, set him apart. Slowly, teachers noticed a change. A boy who once seemed restless was beginning to find purpose. But this transformation was not sudden. It was the result of years of mistakes, lessons, and quiet observations. A boy becoming aware of the larger world. As the 1960s unfolded, the Soviet Union stood tall as a superpower. Yuri Gagarin had flown into space. Soviet athletes dominated at the Olympics. Posters of Lenin and Soviet leaders covered the walls of schools. Young Vladimir absorbed all of it. He began to feel not just like a boy from a poor family, but like a citizen of a great nation. The pride of being Russian, of being part of something vast, entered his heart. This nationalism, seated in childhood, would never leave him. Closing of Part 2. The screen shows a black and white photo of a young boy in a school uniform, standing with a stubborn look in his eyes. The voice of the narrator slows, steady and reflective. Vladimir Putin's childhood was not gentle. It was a battlefield of lessons, fights in courtyards, stern words at home, moments of secret faith and long nights of scarcity. He was not the strongest. He was not the biggest. But he was learning something more valuable: how to endure, how to calculate, how to strike only when the time was right. Childhood had given him the roots of resilience, the hunger for discipline, and the seed of ambition. The boy from the communal apartment was beginning to sense it. His story was only just beginning. Adolescence is a crossroads, when the innocence of childhood collides with the responsibilities of adulthood. For Vladimir Putin, the teenage years were not smooth, not easy, not free of mistakes. They were years of conflict, defiance, and restless ambition. In the classrooms of Leningrad, and in the courtyards outside, young Vladimir confronted his limits. He faced failure. He faced ridicule. He faced the consequences of his own stubborn will. But it was in those years, through trial, frustration, and small moments of awakening, that he began to carve out the steel edge of his character. A troubled student. By the time Putin entered his teenage years, his reputation at school was mixed. Teachers recognized his intelligence, but they also saw his defiance. He skipped classes, ignored rules, and often seemed more interested in his own adventures than in structured lessons. Reports described him as disorganized, unfocused, resistant to authority. His grades slipped. Teachers warned him that unless he changed, his future would be limited. One teacher, frustrated, once told him, "You are capable, Volodya. But if you continue like this, you will waste your life." These words stung. For a boy with pride as sharp as his, failure was unbearable. And yet, he could not deny the truth. He was wasting opportunities. The temptation of the streets. Outside the classroom, the streets of Leningrad called to him. There, in the stairwells and courtyards, he felt freedom. There, fights and challenges tested his toughness. But the streets were dangerous. For many boys, they led to crime, to broken lives, to a dead end. Putin flirted with this path. He was drawn to the adrenaline, to the respect earned in fists and bravado. But somewhere deep inside he knew he wanted more. He wanted not just to survive the streets but to rise above them. Martial arts, a new discipline. It was during these restless years that Putin discovered something that would change his life. Martial arts. At age 12 he began training in Sambo, a Soviet martial art combining judo and wrestling. Soon after, he devoted himself to judo specifically. The small boy who had been underestimated found in martial arts a world where size mattered less than strategy, timing, and willpower. On the mat he learned discipline. He learned patience. He learned respect for opponents. Martial arts taught him that true strength was not reckless, it was controlled. He would later say, "Martial arts teaches you to respect your partner. To know when to attack and when to wait. It teaches you to win not by force but by calculation." Slowly, the energy that had once led him into trouble was being redirected. Social challenges. Despite his progress in martial arts, socially, Putin still faced struggles. He was small for his age, often overlooked. He carried himself with pride, but pride did not always earn friends. Some classmates saw him as aloof. Others underestimated him. For a teenager craving recognition, this was painful. He wanted to stand out, to prove himself. But often he felt invisible. This tension, between pride and invisibility, ambition and limitation, burned inside him. It made him restless. It made him hungry. The pull of intelligence and adventure. As his teenage years unfolded, Putin's fascination with intelligence and espionage grew stronger. He read books about Soviet spies, about invisible battles fought in silence. He admired their discipline, their cunning, their power. While others talked about careers in factories, science, or the military, Vladimir began telling friends that he wanted to join the KGB. For a boy from a poor family in a communal apartment, this was almost unthinkable. The KGB recruited only the best, the disciplined, the exceptional, the loyal. But for Vladimir, this dream became a compass. It gave him direction. It gave him a reason to fight against his own weaknesses. Failure and reflection. But dreams alone could not erase failure. In his mid-teens his grades were still poor. His teachers considered him careless. His parents worried. His future seemed uncertain. It was in this period that Putin faced a mirror moment, a time of self-reflection. He began to realize that if he continued drifting, the door to his dreams would close. The KGB would never accept an undisciplined boy with weak grades. This realization struck him with force. And it forced a change, turning effort into results. From that point, Vladimir began to apply himself. He pushed harder in school. He listened to his teachers. He studied more. He trained with greater focus in judo. It was not an instant transformation. But slowly his reputation began to shift. Teachers noticed improvement. Classmates began to respect his dedication. The small boy who had once been written off was beginning to show signs of something else: determination, emotional battles. Yet even with progress, Putin carried inner battles. He struggled with anger, with pride, with the desire to prove himself. At times, the weight of expectations felt heavy. At times, he doubted himself. But martial arts gave him balance. The discipline of training, the victories in tournaments, the structure of practice, all of these steadied him. They reminded him that even when emotions burned, control was possible. Lessons of adolescence. By the end of his teenage years, Vladimir Putin was no longer the aimless boy of his early adolescence. He had discovered discipline, ambition, and a path forward. But the journey was not without scars. He had tasted failure. He had felt ridicule. He had known what it was to be underestimated. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned something that would stay with him forever. That resilience is forged in struggle, not in comfort. Closing of Part 3. The screen fades to images of a young man in a judo uniform, bowing to an opponent, his eyes sharp with focus. The narrator's voice lowers, deliberate and powerful. Vladimir Putin's teenage years were turbulent. They were years of fights, mistakes, failures, and pride. But they were also the years where he began to discover himself. In the classroom, he learned the cost of wasting talent. In the streets, he learned to stand his ground. On the mat, he learned the value of discipline. The boy from the communal apartment was now becoming a young man, with a dream, a direction, and a will that was hardening into steel. And though the path ahead would not be easy, he had taken his first steps toward destiny. Every life has moments. Moments when the world shifts, when decisions carve out the path of destiny. For Vladimir Putin, those moments did not arrive with grandeur or ceremony. They arrived in the quiet of classrooms, in the sweat of judo mats, in the silence of late-night reflections. They arrived in confrontations, in failures, and in sudden realizations. It was in these formative turning points that a restless boy began to shape himself into a man with purpose. Realization of the KGB dream. The first great turning point came from an idea. Putin was still a teenager when he made a decision that shocked even his closest friends. He wanted to join the KGB. The thought had been building for years, fueled by spy novels, by stories of Soviet intelligence officers who fought unseen battles for their nation. But now it crystallized into determination. He once admitted, "From the very beginning, I knew I wanted to work in intelligence. It fascinated me, the idea of being able to act for the state, but to do it quietly, without recognition, without applause. This dream was not about fame. It was about power, subtle, silent power. But dreams require action. And for Putin that meant transforming his life. Turning against mediocrity. At school, his grades had been inconsistent. He had been known more for fights than for study. But the KGB did not recruit boys who lacked discipline. If he wanted this life, he had to change. So he did. Quietly, methodically, he began to push himself. He studied harder. He disciplined his routine. Teachers noticed the difference. The once disruptive boy was now focused, serious. The change was not easy. He often wrestled with frustration, with impatience. But every time doubt whispered, he returned to the image of himself in the KGB, an officer in the shadows serving the state. That image became his anchor. Judo, the inner transformation. At the same time, martial arts became more than a sport. It became a philosophy. In judo, Putin found lessons that extended far beyond the mat. He learned that strength alone was not victory. Timing, patience, and the ability to turn an opponent's force against them mattered more. He began to see life itself like judo. Every challenge, every obstacle, every opponent could be overcome not with reckless force, but with strategy. His coaches described him as relentless. He trained late into the evenings even when exhausted. And with each victory in local tournaments, his confidence grew. Judo was not just shaping his body. It was shaping his mind. A critical teacher's challenge. One of the most profound turning points came from the words of a teacher. After watching Putin struggle to balance his studies and his passion for martial arts, the teacher pulled him aside and said, "You can be strong, Volodya. But without discipline of the mind, strength means nothing. You must learn to master yourself, not just your opponent." The words struck him deeply. They echoed in his mind long after. Strength without intellect was waste. And intellect without discipline was weakness. This balance became a creed. A visit that sealed his destiny. But the most dramatic turning point came one afternoon in Leningrad, when Putin, still a teenager, walked boldly into the local office of the KGB. He asked a simple question, "How do I join?" The officer at the desk looked at the skinny boy in front of him, amused. He explained that the KGB did not take volunteers so young. If Putin wanted to join, he needed higher education, preferably law school, excellent grades, and proven discipline. For many, this would have been discouraging. For Putin, it was clarifying. The path was now visible, law school first, then the KGB. From that day on, every choice he made bent toward that goal. A private vow. That night, Putin made a vow to himself. He would not waste time. He would not fall into mediocrity. He would rise, no matter how long it took, no matter how many sacrifices it demanded. It was a vow born not of arrogance, but of hunger. The hunger of a boy who had grown up in scarcity, in the shadow of war, in the narrow walls of a communal apartment. He would rise. The turning point of control. In these years, Putin also confronted another reality, his own temper. He was quick to anger, quick to fight. But judo and discipline forced him to confront this flaw. Slowly, he learned that true power was not in unleashing anger but in controlling it. That realization became another turning point. The boy who once lashed out was becoming a young man who could wait, calculate, and strike only when necessary. A sense of mission. By the late 1960s, Vladimir Putin was no longer just a restless teenager. He was a young man with a mission. His dream of joining the KGB had given him focus. Martial arts had given him discipline. His teachers had given him challenges that forced him to grow. For the first time, his path was clear. Closing of Part 4. The screen shows a dimly lit image of a young Vladimir in his judo uniform, bowing on the mat, then shifts to the shadow of the KGB building in Leningrad. The narrator's voice lowers, slow and deliberate. Every life has turning points, moments when direction changes, when purpose takes root. For Vladimir Putin, those moments came not in glory, but in quiet decisions, in private vows, in the discipline of the mat, in the advice of teachers, and in a single visit to a KGB office that set his life on course. The boy from Leningrad had found his compass. He had found his mission. Every great journey begins not with triumph, but with small, uncertain steps. For Vladimir Putin, the road from restless teenager to future leader did not begin in palaces or offices of power. It began in classrooms, training halls, and the gray corridors of Soviet bureaucracy. It began with rejection, with struggle, with moments where his resolve was tested. And yet, in each small beginning lay the seeds of his future rise. Entering Leningrad State University. By the early 1970s, Putin had set his sights on the path the KGB officer had laid out: higher education in law. He applied to Leningrad State University, LSU, a prestigious and competitive institution. For a boy from a poor communal apartment, this was no small step. Admission required excellent grades, determination, and focus. Putin prepared with relentless discipline. His once troubled academic record had transformed. He studied tirelessly, channeling the same drive he had found in judo into his exams. When the acceptance letter arrived, it was more than just a success, it was a confirmation. The path he had chosen years before was now unfolding. A world of ideas. At LSU, Putin entered a new world. The law faculty exposed him to Soviet legal structures, constitutional principles, and state systems. He read Marx and Lenin, but also absorbed broader ideas about governance, power, and order. Professors described him as reserved, disciplined, sometimes quiet, but always attentive. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. Yet beneath his calm surface, his ambition burned. Law school was not his final goal. It was a step toward something larger, the KGB. First encounters with influence. During his time at LSU, Putin came under the mentorship of Anatoly Sobchak, a brilliant young professor who taught constitutional law. Sobchak would later rise to become the mayor of St. Petersburg, and an important figure in Putin's early political career. For now, Sobchak was just a teacher. But his charisma, his intellect, and his vision for a reformed Soviet legal system left an impression on the young student. Putin observed, absorbed, and remembered. Even then, he understood the value of alliances. Life beyond the classroom. But university life was not only study. Putin continued to train in judo and sambo, rising in local competitions, earning respect as a serious athlete. He achieved the level of Master of Sports in judo, a title that reflected not only skill but discipline and recognition. This balance, law by day, judo by evening, defined him. One built his mind, the other built his body. Together they sharpened his resolve. The KGB steps closer. As he neared graduation in 1975, the question loomed: would the KGB come? For years he had dreamed of this moment. But the KGB did not accept applications. They recruited quietly, watching from a distance, selecting only those who showed discipline, loyalty, and intelligence. One day, quietly, they approached him. His dream was no longer a fantasy, it was real. He had been noticed. He had been chosen. The first training. After graduation, Putin officially entered the KGB school in Moscow. Here, the world of shadows unfolded before him. The training was rigorous. Surveillance, counterintelligence, the psychology of persuasion, the science of secrecy. Recruits were tested not only for skill but for loyalty and endurance. Some broke under pressure. Others lost focus. But Putin endured. The boy from the communal apartment had grown into a man who could withstand discipline, deception, and doubt. Instructors noted his calm, his ability to observe silently, his capacity to blend in. He was not flamboyant. He was not loud. He was effective. First assignments. After training, Putin returned to Leningrad as a young KGB officer. His first tasks were not glamorous. He worked in counterintelligence, monitoring foreigners, gathering information, ensuring loyalty within the city. He learned the slow, methodical work of intelligence. Hours of observation, endless reports, the patience of shadows. For many, such work was dull. For Putin, it was preparation. Each file, each case, each assignment was a step toward mastery. The weight of secrecy. Life as a young KGB officer demanded more than skill. It demanded secrecy. Putin could not tell friends or even family the full truth of his work. His life became compartmentalized. On the surface, an ordinary young man, beneath, an officer of the state. This double existence shaped him. He learned to hide his thoughts, to measure his words, to carry secrets as naturally as others carried conversations. First victories. Within a few years, Putin began to earn recognition for his effectiveness. He was promoted. His superiors saw in him a man who was not only loyal but precise. It was not fame. It was not public honor. It was quiet acknowledgement within the walls of the KGB. And for Putin, that was enough. Every success, no matter how small, was proof he was where he was meant to be. The discipline of patience. But perhaps the greatest lesson of these early years was patience. As a young man, Putin had once been restless, eager for recognition. Now he was learning the art of waiting. In intelligence work, timing was everything. To act too soon was failure. To wait too long was weakness. He learned to balance, to read situations, to move only when the moment was right. This discipline would later become one of his defining traits as a leader. Every career has moments when the quiet preparation of years bursts into opportunity, when the skills forged in silence are tested by history itself. For Vladimir Putin, this breakthrough came not in Moscow, not in Leningrad, but in a city behind the Iron Curtain, Dresden, East Germany. Here, in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, Putin would find himself at the center of global tension. Here he would taste both the power of the KGB and the fragility of empires. And here he would take steps that would shape the man the world would one day come to know. Assignment to East Germany. In 1985, after years of service in Leningrad, Putin received his most important assignment yet. He was sent abroad, deep into the heart of East Germany, one of the Soviet Union's most crucial allies. Dresden was not Berlin. It was not glamorous, not a hub of global espionage like the capital. But it was strategically important. It was a listening post, a place where the East watched the West, where whispers of NATO strategies, German politics, and Western influence flowed like currents beneath the surface. Putin arrived with his wife, Ludmila, and their young daughters. To the outside world, he appeared as a cultural officer working at the Soviet-German Friendship House. In reality, he was a KGB officer tasked with intelligence gathering, recruitment, and maintaining the fragile balance of Soviet influence. Life in Dresden. Dresden in the 1980s was a city of contrasts. Beautiful Baroque architecture stood beside the scars of World War II. The city was under strict East German control, its people watched by the Stasi, the feared East German secret police. Putin learned to navigate this world with caution. He built networks. He worked with Stasi officers. He monitored potential threats. To his neighbors he was polite, reserved, a man who blended into the background. To his superiors he was efficient, loyal, and dependable. Small successes, quiet recognition. Putin was not the flamboyant spy of Hollywood films. He was not James Bond. He was methodical, careful, precise. His work in Dresden earned him respect not for bold moves, but for quiet consistency. He recruited sources. He analyzed reports. He kept order in a city where whispers mattered as much as weapons. Each success, though small, reinforced his reputation. Within the KGB, he was becoming known as someone who could be trusted, someone who could deliver. The collapse of the wall. But history does not wait. In 1989, the world shifted. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of division between East and West, began to crumble. Across East Germany, protests erupted. Crowds filled the streets, demanding freedom, demanding change. In Dresden, the KGB headquarters became a target. Demonstrators surrounded the building, shouting, demanding access to the archives, to the secrets inside. Inside, Putin and his colleagues faced a terrifying moment. The building was vulnerable. The Soviet Union was paralyzed, uncertain, unable to respond. When Putin called for reinforcements, Moscow's reply was chilling. We cannot do anything without orders. And we have no orders. For a man trained in the discipline of the KGB, this was unthinkable. The state he had devoted himself to was showing weakness. Putin later described this night as a turning point. It became clear the country was no longer the same. It had lost its power, its control. The great empire was on the verge of collapse. The lesson of Dresden. That night, as crowds pressed against the gates, Putin made a decision. He ordered the destruction of sensitive files. Flames rose from the furnaces as documents burned, names, codes, years of intelligence reduced to ash. The building was saved. The archives remained secret. But the experience left a scar. For Putin, Dresden was not just an assignment. It was a revelation. He had seen firsthand what happened when a state lost its authority. He had seen the fragility of power. And he vowed never to let it happen again. Return to Leningrad. In 1990, after 5 years in Dresden, Putin returned to a Soviet Union that was unraveling. The empire he had served abroad was collapsing at home. The Communist Party was weakening. Protests and reforms swept through the country. For many KGB officers, this was the end. Their careers crumbled with the state they had served. But for Putin, it was the beginning of something new. Meeting Sobchak again. Back in Leningrad, fate reintroduced him to Anatoly Sobchak, his former professor at LSU, now a rising political figure. Sobchak, a reformer, had become chairman of the Leningrad City Council and was on his way to becoming mayor of St. Petersburg. Sobchak needed loyal, disciplined people around him, people he could trust in the chaos of post-Soviet politics. He remembered his quiet, serious student Vladimir Putin. Putin joined Sobchak's team, leaving behind the shadows of the KGB for the uncertain light of politics. The first taste of political power. In his new role, Putin was responsible for foreign relations and attracting investment to St. Petersburg. It was not glamorous work, but it was vital. The city was hungry, its economy in ruins, its people desperate. Putin's discipline, his ability to negotiate, his quiet efficiency impressed Sobchak. In a world of loud politicians, Putin stood out by being the opposite. Calm, methodical, unshakable. Here, for the first time, he tasted political influence. And he realized something powerful. What he once sought in the shadows of the KGB, he could now achieve in the open arena of politics. Recognition and rise. By the mid-1990s, Putin had risen steadily through the ranks of St. Petersburg's administration. He was trusted, respected, and relied upon. When Sobchak lost power in 1996, Putin's career could have ended. But instead, his reputation carried him forward. He was invited to Moscow to join the presidential administration. The boy from the communal apartment, the quiet KGB officer from Dresden, was now stepping onto the national stage. His breakthrough was complete. Behind the headlines, behind the politics, behind the iron mask of power, there is the man. Every leader, no matter how formidable, carries within them a private world of relationships, values, and quiet battles invisible to the public eye. For Vladimir Putin, this personal life would remain one of the most guarded elements of his existence. Yet, it shaped him as deeply as the corridors of the Kremlin ever would. Meeting Ludmila. It was the late 1970s in Leningrad. Putin was no longer the restless boy from the communal apartment. He was a young man, disciplined, a law student on his way toward the KGB. One evening, through friends, he met Ludmila Shkrebneva, a flight attendant for Aeroflot. She was intelligent, lively, and brought with her the warmth of Siberia, where she had grown up. Their connection was quiet at first, two very different temperaments, yet drawn together by a sense of stability and respect. For Ludmila, Putin was not the stereotypical young Soviet man. He was serious, almost mysterious. For Putin, Ludmila was a balance, gentle, steady, capable of grounding his restless ambition. After a few years of courtship, they married in 1983, a family abroad. Their early years of marriage were far from ordinary. Shortly after their wedding, Putin's KGB assignment took them to Dresden, East Germany. For Ludmila, it was a difficult transition. She once recalled, "It was a time of hardship. We lived modestly, we had very little money. He was often away, and I had to raise our children in a foreign land." In Dresden, their two daughters, Maria and Katerina, were born. Putin's work demanded secrecy, long hours, and a life where explanations were often impossible. Ludmila shouldered the weight of family, while Putin carried the burden of state service. It was not an easy balance. Yet, in these years, the foundation of his family was built, a bond shaped by endurance and sacrifice. Return to Russia, a changed home. When the Putins returned to Leningrad in the early 1990s, they entered a world transformed. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The economy was in chaos. People stood in breadlines. Families survived on rations. For Putin's household, this was not just a political crisis, it was personal. They lived in modest apartments, sometimes struggling financially. Ludmila later described this period as one of instability and hardship, where even basics were uncertain. But within that hardship, values were forged: resilience, discipline, the refusal to surrender to despair. Putin the father. Putin's relationship with his daughters was shaped by the secrecy of his work and later, by the demands of public office. Unlike many politicians, he kept his children almost entirely out of the public eye. Few photographs exist. Their names were rarely spoken in public. This secrecy was not distance, it was protection. For a man who understood the dangers of exposure, shielding his daughters was an act of love. In private, he was said to be attentive, even playful. He supported their studies, encouraged discipline, and insisted on privacy. In his world, the family was sacred, and protection meant invisibility. The weight of discipline. Those who knew Putin personally often spoke of his discipline. He was a man of routines. Early mornings, physical exercise, careful schedules. Even in his private life, he sought control. He rose early to swim, sometimes for long stretches, using the rhythm of water to focus his mind. He practiced judo, maintaining not only strength but the philosophy of balance and control the martial art had taught him. This discipline extended to his family values. For Putin, loyalty and responsibility were non-negotiable. His marriage, though not without tension, was built on these principles. Strains in the marriage. Yet, as years passed and Putin's career rose, the demands of public life grew heavier. Ludmila once admitted, "Our marriage has given us love, but it has also given us trials." The secrecy of Dresden, the hardships of the 1990s, the constant movement of political life. All of it created distance. Ludmila preferred a quieter life, while Putin's destiny pulled him further into the spotlight. By the time Putin became president, their marriage was under strain. Publicly, they remained together for years, presenting unity. Privately, the challenges grew. In 2013, in a rare joint television appearance, they announced their separation, describing it as a mutual, civilized decision. Ludmila said, "We practically never see each other. Each of us has our own life." Their divorce, handled with dignity, reflected not scandal but the reality of a life consumed by state responsibilities. Faith and identity. In his personal life, faith also played a quiet role. Though raised in the Soviet Union, a state officially atheist, Putin was baptized as an infant in secret by his mother. As he grew older, especially after surviving political crises and personal challenges, he increasingly turned toward the Russian Orthodox Church. He wore a small cross given to him by his mother, and during difficult times, such as a fire that nearly consumed his home abroad, he believed it had protected him. For Putin, faith was not loud or performative. It was quiet, personal, a thread that bound him to his past and his people. The philosophy of privacy. Unlike many world leaders, Putin has kept his personal life behind a wall of secrecy. His daughters live private lives away from cameras. His family matters are rarely discussed. Some see this as coldness. Others see it as protection. For Putin, the line was clear. The state belonged to the people, but the family belonged only to him. Personal challenges. Even as his career soared, Putin faced personal challenges. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left scars: financial strain, uncertainty, the fear of instability. His marriage, though lasting decades, ultimately ended. The weight of leadership often demanded isolation. And yet, through all of it, the personal foundation he built, discipline, family loyalty, faith and privacy, remained unbroken. Behind the headlines, behind the politics, behind the iron mask of power, there is the man. Every leader, no matter how formidable, carries within them a private world of relationships, values, and quiet battles invisible to the public eye. For Vladimir Putin, this personal life would remain one of the most guarded elements of his existence. Yet, it shaped him as deeply as the corridors of the Kremlin ever would. Meeting Ludmila. It was the late 1970s in Leningrad. Putin was no longer the restless boy from the communal apartment. He was a young man, disciplined, a law student on his way toward the KGB. One evening, through friends, he met Ludmila Shkrebneva, a flight attendant for Aeroflot. She was intelligent, lively, and brought with her the warmth of Siberia, where she had grown up. Their connection was quiet at first, two very different temperaments, yet drawn together by a sense of stability and respect. For Ludmila, Putin was not the stereotypical young Soviet man. He was serious, almost mysterious. For Putin, Ludmila was a balance, gentle, steady, capable of grounding his restless ambition. After a few years of courtship, they married in 1983, a family abroad. Their early years of marriage were far from ordinary. Shortly after their wedding, Putin's KGB assignment took them to Dresden, East Germany. For Ludmila it was a difficult transition. She once recalled, "It was a time of hardship. We lived modestly, we had very little money. He was often away and I had to raise our children in a foreign land." In Dresden their 2 daughters, Maria and Katerina, were born. Putin's work demanded secrecy, long hours, and a life where explanations were often impossible. Ludmila shouldered the weight of family, while Putin carried the burden of state service. It was not an easy balance. Yet, in these years the foundation of his family was built, a bond shaped by endurance and sacrifice. Return to Russia, a changed home. When the Putins returned to Leningrad in the early 1990s, they entered a world transformed. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The economy was in chaos. People stood in bread lines. Families survived on rations. For Putin's household, this was not just a political crisis, it was personal. They lived in modest apartments, sometimes struggling financially. Ludmila later described this period as one of instability and hardship, where even basics were uncertain. But within that hardship, values were forged: resilience, discipline, the refusal to surrender to despair. Putin the father. Putin's relationship with his daughters was shaped by the secrecy of his work and later, by the demands of public office. Unlike many politicians, he kept his children almost entirely out of the public eye. Few photographs exist. Their names were rarely spoken in public. This secrecy was not distance, it was protection. For a man who understood the dangers of exposure, shielding his daughters was an act of love. In private he was said to be attentive, even playful. He supported their studies, encouraged discipline, and insisted on privacy. In his world, the family was sacred, and protection meant invisibility. The weight of discipline. Those who knew Putin personally often spoke of his discipline. He was a man of routines. Early mornings, physical exercise, careful schedules. Even in his private life he sought control. He rose early to swim, sometimes for long stretches, using the rhythm of water to focus his mind. He practiced judo, maintaining not only strength but the philosophy of balance and control the martial art had taught him. This discipline extended to his family values. For Putin, loyalty and responsibility were non-negotiable. His marriage, though not without tension, was built on these principles. Strains in the marriage. Yet, as years passed and Putin's career rose, the demands of public life grew heavier. Ludmila once admitted, "Our marriage has given us love, but it has also given us trials." The secrecy of Dresden, the hardships of the 1990s, the constant movement of political life. All of it created distance. Ludmila preferred a quieter life, while Putin's destiny pulled him further into the spotlight. By the time Putin became president, their marriage was under strain. Publicly they remained together for years, presenting unity. Privately the challenges grew. In 2013, in a rare joint television appearance, they announced their separation, describing it as a mutual, civilized decision. Ludmila said, "We practically never see each other. Each of us has our own life." Their divorce, handled with dignity, reflected not scandal but the reality of a life consumed by state responsibilities. Faith and identity. In his personal life, faith also played a quiet role. Though raised in the Soviet Union, a state officially atheist, Putin was baptized as an infant in secret by his mother. As he grew older, especially after surviving political crises and personal challenges, he increasingly turned toward the Russian Orthodox Church. He wore a small cross given to him by his mother, and during difficult times, such as a fire that nearly consumed his home abroad, he believed it had protected him. For Putin, faith was not loud or performative. It was quiet, personal, a thread that bound him to his past and his people. The philosophy of privacy. Unlike many world leaders, Putin has kept his personal life behind a wall of secrecy. His daughters live private lives away from cameras. His family matters are rarely discussed. Some see this as coldness. Others see it as protection. For Putin the line was clear: the state belonged to the people but the family belonged only to him. Personal challenges. Even as his career soared, Putin faced personal challenges. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left scars: financial strain, uncertainty, the fear of instability. His marriage, though lasting decades, ultimately ended. The weight of leadership often demanded isolation. And yet, through all of it, the personal foundation he built, discipline, family loyalty, faith and privacy, remained unbroken. Every throne carries its weight. Every crown its thorns. No leader, no matter how powerful, escapes the trials that test both their resolve and their humanity. For Vladimir Putin, the path to the top was never smooth. And even at the very height of power, challenges rose: criticism, conflict, obstacles that threatened to undo everything he had built. This is the story of those storms. The burden of criticism. From the very beginning of his presidency, Putin faced a divided world. At home, many celebrated him as the man who brought order out of chaos, who paid pensions, who tamed the oligarchs, who gave Russia dignity again. But critics, both inside and outside Russia, accused him of tightening control too far. Independent media voices faced restrictions. Political opponents claimed unfair treatment. International organizations raised alarms about freedom of speech and democracy. Putin, however, rarely wavered. His belief was simple: stability first, liberty later. For him, a strong state was the foundation of all else. Without order, freedom would collapse into chaos, as he had witnessed in Dresden and in the ruins of the 1990s. Yet the criticism never disappeared. It followed him through every decision, every term, every stage of his leadership. The shadow of terrorism. No challenge tested him more painfully than terrorism. The Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002. The Beslan school tragedy in 2004. These were not only attacks on the state, they were attacks on the most vulnerable: families, children, innocents. Putin faced the cameras after Beslan, his voice heavy with grief. "We showed weakness. And the weak get beaten." It was a chilling admission, but also a declaration of intent. He vowed never to allow such weakness again. Security tightened. Military operations intensified. Critics condemned the harshness. Supporters saw strength. But in the private space of his own soul, these tragedies weighed on him deeply. They were scars that no achievement could erase. The challenge of oligarchs. In the early 2000s, another battle defined his presidency: the confrontation with the oligarchs. These were men who had grown wealthy in the 1990s, seizing control of Russia's vast resources during privatization. They wielded enormous power, sometimes greater than the state itself. Putin made it clear: their time was over. The state would be supreme. The arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, sent shockwaves through the business elite. To some, it was justice. To others, it was authoritarianism. But the message was unmistakable: no one, no matter how rich, would stand above the state. Strains with the West. On the international stage, Putin faced storms as well. In the early years, he sought cooperation with the West. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, he was the first leader to call President George W. Bush, offering support. Russia even allowed U.S. forces to use Central Asian bases for operations in Afghanistan. But as time passed, tensions grew. NATO expanded eastward. The U.S. withdrew from arms treaties. Color revolutions swept through former Soviet republics, weakening Moscow's influence. To Putin, these were not coincidences. They were threats. He pushed back, sometimes diplomatically, sometimes forcefully. The 2008 war in Georgia, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the confrontation in Syria, each move deepened divisions with the West. Critics called it aggression. Supporters called it defense of sovereignty. But either way, the challenge was clear: Russia was once again a rival to the West. The weight of sanctions. With conflict came consequences. Western nations imposed sanctions, targeting banks, energy companies, individuals close to the Kremlin. The Russian economy slowed. The ruble fell. Ordinary citizens felt the strain. For Putin, sanctions were not merely economic, they were symbolic. They were meant to weaken Russia, to weaken him. His response was defiance. He promoted domestic industries, turned to Asian partners, and rallied his people around the idea of resistance. It was not easy, but it became a test of endurance both for him and for the nation. Lessons from power. Even at the top, obstacles were constant. The criticism, the terrorism, the oligarch battles, the sanctions, each one could have broken a weaker leader. But Putin's life had taught him lessons. From the streets of Leningrad to the chaos of Dresden, from the fall of the Soviet Union to the rise of the new Russia, he had learned to endure. He understood the philosophy of judo: use the weight of your opponent against them, stay balanced, never lose focus. And so, through every storm, he remained unshaken. The price of leadership. Yet power always has a price. Putin's marriage, strained for years, ended in divorce. Critics grew louder. International isolation deepened. Personal attacks from abroad became relentless. Leadership for him meant loneliness. It meant carrying burdens few could understand. And still he pressed forward. For in his mind, the alternative, the collapse of the state, was unthinkable. Closing of Part 9. The screen fades into slow motion. Protests in Moscow, sanctions headlines, war footage, Putin walking through long Kremlin corridors alone. The narrator's voice drops, almost a whisper filled with gravity. Even at the top of power, Vladimir Putin faced storms that would have crushed lesser men. Criticism, terror, oligarchs, sanctions, isolation. Each challenge was a test. Each obstacle, a lesson. Each storm endured. For Putin, the measure of leadership was not in avoiding hardship, but in standing firm when the storm was at its fiercest. And in this, his legacy would be sealed. Every life leaves behind an imprint. Some fade quickly. Others endure for centuries. The story of Vladimir Putin is not one of ordinary leadership. It is the story of a man who rose from the crumbling courtyards of post-war Leningrad, carved his way through the chaos of a collapsing empire, and stood at the helm of a nation reborn. His legacy, like all legacies, is complex. Admired by some, condemned by others. Celebrated for restoring strength, criticized for tightening control. But beyond politics, beyond power, lies a deeper question. What does history remember? The image of the strong state. For Russians who lived through the turmoil of the 1990s, Putin's rise meant more than political change. It meant salaries paid on time. It meant stability after years of fear. It meant the return of dignity after humiliation on the world stage. He became the embodiment of the strong Russian state, disciplined, centralized, unyielding. His supporters saw him as the modern successor to the Tsars, a guardian who restored order and gave the nation a voice once more. Whether praised or condemned, this image became his hallmark. Putin as the protector of Russian sovereignty. Influence beyond borders. But Putin's influence was not confined to Russia. Across the world, leaders watched his methods. Some saw in him a blueprint for maintaining authority in an age of turbulence. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, a rival to liberal democracy. He shifted the global balance. He reminded the West that Russia was not to be underestimated. He showed that a single determined leader, grounded in history and resilience, could alter the course of geopolitics. His actions in Syria, Georgia, Crimea, and beyond reshaped maps and alliances. For supporters, these were acts of defense, protecting Russian interests, shielding the homeland. For critics, they were acts of aggression. But no one could ignore him. A polarizing figure. History rarely deals in absolutes. For every Russian who sees him as a savior, there is another who sees him as an obstacle to progress. For every foreign observer who views him as a defender of tradition, there is one who calls him a threat to freedom. Putin himself seemed aware of this paradox. He once remarked, "History will judge us all. But we must act according to our conscience and the interests of our people." This duality, admiration and condemnation, love and fear, is part of what ensures his name will endure in history books for generations to come. Personal discipline and philosophy. Beyond politics, Putin's personal philosophy shaped his legacy. He lived by the rules of judo, patience, balance, using the opponent's force against them. He believed in endurance and control and strength through discipline. His daily life reflected this. Rigid routines. Long working hours. Focus on health and physical training. For him, leadership was not simply about speeches and ceremonies, it was about embodying resilience. To many, this discipline was part of his mystique. The image of Putin, bare-chested on horseback, diving into icy waters, practicing martial arts, it all projected not just power but determination. Lessons from his journey. From his journey, future generations could extract lessons both inspiring and cautionary. From the boy in the streets of Leningrad, never give up no matter how humble your beginnings. From the young spy in Dresden, adapt to change even when the world collapses around you. From the leader who faced terrorism and sanctions, stand firm even when the storm rages. Yet also from the controversies, power must be balanced with responsibility. And from the criticism, strength without compassion risks alienation. His life story is a mirror in which nations, leaders, and ordinary people may see reflections of both courage and caution. Eternal inspiration for some. For millions in Russia and beyond, Putin remains a symbol of resilience. The boy who once lived in a rat-infested apartment rose to command one of the most powerful nations on earth. His journey inspires those who believe in overcoming hardship, who believe in turning weakness into strength. For them, his legacy is proof that history is not written by the comfortable, but by those willing to endure struggle. An unfinished story. And yet, Putin's story is not finished. Legacy is not only what one has done but what one leaves behind. His influence continues to shape Russia, to shape geopolitics, to shape the very questions of power and sovereignty in the modern age. History will continue to debate him. Some will write his name alongside the great nation builders. Others will place him among the controversial figures of the modern era. But one thing is certain: he cannot be forgotten. Cinematic closing. The camera shows Moscow at night, the Kremlin lit in gold, the Russian flag fluttering against a dark sky. Then, images of Putin's life. A boy in a worn jacket, a KGB officer in Dresden, a president speaking in Red Square, a man alone in the Kremlin corridors. The violin swells, joined by drums, a sound of both triumph and melancholy. Final narration. From the ruins of war-torn Leningrad. From the collapse of an empire. From the shadows of uncertainty. Vladimir Putin rose. To some he is a hero. To others a villain. To history he is a force, a man who changed the trajectory of his nation and challenged the balance of the world. His legacy is not written in black or white, but in the gray struggles of human existence. And as time marches on, one truth remains. The boy who once fought for survival on the frozen streets of Leningrad carved his name into history. And his story, love him or hate him, will echo for generations to come.